911. What's your emergency? There's blood in the pool. The woman's voice quivered. She's not moving. Please hurry. It was a scorching August afternoon in Clearwater Springs, Florida. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and the silence feel thick. Clara Monroe had been tending to her garden, just beyond the weathered wooden fence that separated her yard from Julia Banks's. She had heard the usual splashes from the pool, routine, uneventful. Julia was often out there with her alligator, Reef. But then came the scream, piercing, wet, desperate. Clara's gardening gloves hit the dirt as she raced toward the sound, heart hammering. What she saw over the fence would haunt her for the rest of her life. The water in Julia's pool churned violently, murky with debris and streaks of red. Julia thrashed against something massive beneath the surface, her face barely breaking the water before vanishing again. Reef, that alligator she'd raised since he was small enough to fit in a shoebox. Now over 7 feet of prehistoric muscle, Reef had his jaws locked around her leg, dragging her toward the deep end. She's screaming, Clara told the 911 dispatcher. She's screaming and going under. The operator's voice was calm, practiced. Stay on the line. Help is on the way. Is she conscious? I think so, but he's spinning her, like twisting. There's so much blood. From a quiet suburban street to a scene of primal horror in less than a minute. Neighbors began spilling out onto porches, drawn by the noise, by the chaos. No one dared to jump the fence. No one knew how to stop a wild animal trained only by affection. The dispatcher stayed on the line. Clara sobbed. In the distance, the faint echo of sirens began to rise. Julia's backyard had always looked like a sanctuary, a carefully tended garden. Faded wind chimes near the patio. A white wooden chair where she'd sit with a book while Reef floated nearby. It didn't look like the kind of place where someone would die. But now it was chaos. Blood marred the water. A scream choked into silence. And Reef, the very creature she had saved, circled silently in the deep end. Clara could hardly watch, but she couldn't look away either. The pool, once clear and blue, was now a sickening mess of cloudy swirls and stillness. She's not above the water anymore, Clara whispered. I can't see her. Oh God. The dispatcher asked for her location again. Confirmed emergency teams were 2 minutes out. But Clara knew. 2 minutes was too long. Across the street, Mr. Lyles, a retired wildlife officer, stood on his porch, eyes wide, unmoving. He had warned Julia before. That thing's gonna remember it's not your friend one day, he had told her. But she had just smiled. Everyone thought Reef was different. Trained. Tame. Julia had built her life around that belief. Now she was underwater. Motionless. By the time the first responders arrived, firefighters, paramedics, Florida Wildlife Commission officers, they found Clara waving them in, shouting through tears. She's in the pool. The Gator has her. They charged through the gate and stopped cold. The surface of the pool was mostly still now, only a faint ripple, and the shape of Reef, hovering like a shadow beneath the water. No one spoke for a moment. The sound of the ambulance siren faded behind them. Then came movement, officers approaching with long poles, paramedics shouting commands, and one diver stepping forward, stripped down to jump in if needed. But in that moment, as they stood on the edge of Julia's backyard pool, a truth hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was 5 years in the making. 5 years before the 911 call shattered Clearwater Springs, the story began in a swamp. Julia Banks was 23 years old when she found him, barely 6 inches long, eyes wide, chirping softly in the mud near the edge of the Appalachian swamp. She had been volunteering with a wildlife rescue team that day, collecting water samples and photographing nesting birds. But what caught her attention wasn't the birds. It was the fragile little creature half-submerged in algae and reed, an alligator hatchling, alone, likely orphaned. Most people would have walked away. Some would have called wildlife control. But Julia didn't. She crouched slowly, whispering gently, as if the hatchling could understand. And then, with practiced hands and a soft towel from her kit, she scooped him up. She would later tell friends that it wasn't a decision. It felt like something I had already done in my heart, she'd say. She named him Reef. At the time, Julia was completing her certification in wildlife rehabilitation. Animals weren't just her passion, they were her purpose. Orphaned raccoons, injured owls, possums hit by cars. Her modest home on the edge of town was a revolving door for the wounded and abandoned. But none had stayed. Until Reef. She secured a special Class 2 wildlife permit through the state of Florida, allowing her to keep and care for the alligator indefinitely as part of her rehabilitation practice. The permit required inspections, paperwork, enclosure upgrades. Julia didn't mind. Reef, she believed, was worth it. In those early months, she raised him like a child. Heating lamps, filtered tanks, water temp checks twice a day. She fed him a specialized diet of ground turkey and fish mixed with supplements. And always with a tap of the spoon against the glass to signal feeding time. He learned fast. He began to recognize her voice, her scent. "It's like he thinks I'm his mom," she joked in a video, cradling the young gator in a towel like a puppy. "He's imprinted on me. You're not dangerous, are you, buddy?" The bond deepened with time. By the second year, Reef was nearly 4 feet long. He no longer lived inside, but in a custom-built outdoor enclosure with a filtered pond and basking stones. Julia spent hours with him each day, feeding, cleaning, talking to him as if he could respond. And maybe, in his own reptilian way, he did. Her social media began to fill with videos. Reef swimming beside her, Reef sunbathing while she read, Reef calmly resting his head on her knee. Viewers were stunned. Some called it beautiful, others, reckless. Still, there was no denying the connection. Reef showed no aggression, no snapping, no hissing. Julia posted regularly, always using the same hashtag. #ReefTheGentleGator. To many, she was an animal whisperer. To her, she was just doing what she was meant to do. But not everyone saw it that way. Veteran wildlife officers began to raise quiet concerns. Reef was growing. His instincts, they warned, would follow. One officer, Kenneth Lyles, remembered visiting Julia's home for an annual check. "He looked calm," he'd recall later, "but he watched me the whole time. Not scared, not curious, calculating." Julia brushed off the concern. "He's not like other gators," she insisted. "He knows me." She wasn't naive. She understood what alligators were capable of. But she believed Reef was different. That 5 years of love, structure, and presence had rewritten his nature. It was a beautiful idea. It was also dangerously wrong. Because Reef wasn't forgetting what he was. He was just waiting. By the time Reef turned 5, he was over 7.5 feet long and weighed close to 300 pounds. His body had thickened with dense, muscular power. His tail, once soft and harmless, now moved like a whip. His snout had grown wide, and his bite, if measured, would rival the force of a lion's. Julia knew these facts, but to her they didn't change anything. In her eyes, Reef was still the hatchling who once chirped in her palm. But the people around her had started to see something different. Her neighbor, Tom Renshaw, once saw Reef slam his tail into the pool fence when Julia brought out a bucket of food. "It wasn't playful," he told a local reporter. "It was like he was testing it. Testing how far he could go." Another neighbor, a teenage girl walking her dog past Julia's property, said she saw Reef lunge toward the chain-link gate. His jaws opened. It was fast. "Scared me so bad I ran back home." Inside Julia's circle, the concern grew quieter, but deeper. Friends sent her messages. Some called. Others left comments under her Instagram videos. "He's huge now, Jules. Please be careful. Maybe it's time to build a stronger barrier? You sure he still recognizes you like before?" She rarely replied. And when she did, it was gentle defiance. "He's not dangerous. He just needs trust. People are afraid of what they don't understand." Wildlife Officer Kenneth Lyles returned that summer for another inspection. He was now visibly uneasy. Reef's enclosure had been converted into Julia's in-ground pool. Legal under her permit, but only under strict guidelines. Lyles noted the fading condition of the pool gate, the growing proximity between animal and owner. He didn't hold back. "He's not a dog, Julia," he said plainly. "Instinct doesn't retire." Julia smiled, a tired kind of smile. "I've had him 5 years, Ken. He's never so much as snapped at me." "That's what scares me," he replied. He wasn't the only expert worried. Dr. Leah Torres, a herpetologist and animal behaviorist with over 20 years of field experience, later reviewed Julia's case. "I watched some of her videos," Dr. Torres said in a televised interview after the incident. What the public interpreted as affection was, from a behavioral standpoint, conditioning. The alligator wasn't bonded. It was trained, temporarily. But Julia couldn't see it. Or maybe she didn't want to. Reef had become more than a pet. He was her companion, her comfort during hard times, her proof that empathy could reach even the wildest heart. She posted videos of him resting near her as she read, sometimes brushing her fingers over his scaly jaw while he lay still in the sun. "He trusts me," she said in one clip. "People say reptiles don't feel anything. I don't believe that. I think Reef knows who I am." But beneath that calm surface, something old and primal was stirring. Reef had stopped responding to her spoon taps during feeding. His eyes, once soft and blinking, had become fixed, watchful. Feeding times turned tense. He snapped harder, faster, sometimes surging forward before the food even hit the water. Julia stopped hand-feeding him altogether, tossing whole chickens from a distance instead. Yet she kept swimming with him, kept trusting him, even as his movements became harder to read, even as he began circling her underwater. Online, the comments section started to shift. Less awe, more anxiety. "Please don't get in with him again. He's not playing. He's sizing you up. This is going to end badly. I can feel it." She never deleted the warnings. She never answered them either. But in private, some say she started to worry. She just didn't stop. And by the summer of 2023, the clock was almost out of time. August 18th, 2023. The sky above Clearwater Springs was a washed-out white, the kind that warned of another suffocatingly humid afternoon. Heat clung to every surface. The neighborhood buzzed lazily with cicadas, sprinklers, and the occasional lawn mower. It was the kind of day Julia Banks had lived 100 times before, barefoot on her patio, carrying a plastic bucket in one hand and a pool skimmer in the other. Inside that bucket was what remained of Reef's morning feeding. Bones, feathers, scraps. He'd already eaten a full meal. He should have been calm. Julia didn't hesitate. She set the bucket aside and slid her sandals off, dipping her toes into the cloudy pool. It had been gathering algae again. Too many leaves, not enough chlorine. She had cleaned it before, dozens of times. Even with Reef in it, she had stopped thinking of him as a threat long ago. Across the fence, Clara Monroe pulled weeds from her flower bed. She heard the gate creak open, heard the splash, then silence, then something different. A thud, a splash, a scream, raw, sudden, and terrifying. "Reef, no!" Julia's voice cracked, then disappeared beneath the water. Clara stood up so fast she knocked her watering can over. She moved toward the fence, calling Julia's name. Nothing answered her, only splashing, violent and rhythmic. As Clara peered over the wooden slats, her knees buckled. The water in Julia's pool was spinning in violent circles. Reef's tail whipped out of the surface like a thick rope. Julia's arms reached upward, then vanished again. Reef had clamped onto her right leg. The bite wasn't exploratory. It was intentional, deep, crushing. His body coiled in a blur of muscle and instinct as he began the death roll, an ancient tactic designed not just to kill, but to tear. Julia screamed again, but it was shorter this time, more gurgle than cry. Her hands slapped against the surface, trying to grab the edge. Blood bloomed in the water, cloudy, warm, and red. The pool turned into something unrecognizable. Clara stumbled backward, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. 911, she said aloud, over and over as she tapped the screen. "There's blood in the water. He's killing her." Reef continued rolling, A wild instinct had taken over, a storm of jaws and tail and ancient, cold-blooded purpose. The animal Julia had once wrapped in a towel was now a 7-foot predator using every ounce of his power to end her life. Neighbors began to gather. No one moved toward the fence. Some froze. Others shouted Julia's name. But no one knew what to do. Who jumps into a pool with a full-grown alligator? The screams stopped. Julia's body went still beneath the surface, dragged toward the deep end. The pool was quiet now except for Reef. He floated low and slow, the tip of his snout barely breaking the surface. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance. But Reef didn't hear them. He didn't remember the years of feeding schedules, towel baths, or whispered names. He didn't recognize the voice that once called him "my boy." He was doing what his ancestors had done for millions of years. At 3:17 p.m., paramedics and wildlife officers rushed through Julia's backyard gate. Clara pointed, sobbing, toward the pool. They saw only murky water and a dark shape gliding slowly beneath it. Julia had entered the pool like she had countless times before. Confident, assured, unafraid. This time, she never came back out on her own. The moment emergency responders reached the pool, a grim silence swept over Julia's backyard. Paramedics held back as officers from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission stepped forward, wielding long control poles and tranquilizer equipment. Reef floated motionless in the deep end, his body half submerged, nostrils just above the surface. For a terrifying moment, no one knew where Julia was. Then a ripple, pale arm surfaced. A dive team member moved quickly, breaking the water with one sharp motion. He grabbed hold of Julia's body and dragged her to the edge. She was limp, her skin bluish and torn. The waterlogged fabric of her t-shirt clung to her frame, shredded at the thigh where Reef had struck. The wound was catastrophic. Deep punctures, ripped flesh, clear bite marks. And she wasn't breathing. The team didn't pause. They pulled her onto the poolside tiles and began CPR. One paramedic checked for a pulse. Another shouted for the defibrillator. A radio crackled in the background. Severe trauma, massive blood loss, possible drowning. Clara Monroe stood frozen at the fence, hands clasped over her mouth. She had seen things in those last few minutes that no neighbor, no friend, should ever witness. Around her, more residents gathered in silence. No one took out a phone. No one dared speak. The scene before them was not something you filmed. It was something you prayed you'd forget. After what felt like an eternity, Julia's body was loaded into the back of the ambulance. She was still unresponsive. The paramedics kept working as the doors slammed shut. Behind them, wildlife officers prepared for a different kind of operation. Reef had not fled. He lingered near the pool's edge, unervingly still, watching. 2 officers carefully approached, tranquilizer rifles aimed and ready. Took 2 darts to subdue him. His body thrashed once, powerful, heavy, before he began to slow. They waited. Then, with a practiced calm, they restrained him using reinforced straps and hauled his massive frame out of the water. He was loaded into a transport crate, sealed and secured. For the first time in over 5 years, Reef left Julia's property. He would never return. Julia was rushed to the nearest trauma center. Doctors met the ambulance at the ER bay. A surgical team was called in immediately, but the damage was already done. Despite multiple blood transfusions and emergency intubation, Julia never regained consciousness. The drowning, combined with massive leg trauma and cardiac arrest, had overwhelmed her body. At 6:12 p.m., Julia Banks was pronounced dead. News of her death traveled fast. By nightfall, the story had broken across Florida media outlets. Local woman killed by pet alligator. Wildlife rehabber dies in tragic backyard incident. National news picked it up within 24 hours. Her name was everywhere. So was Reef's. Friends gathered outside her home with candles, photos, and handwritten signs. Some cried openly. Others simply stood in silence. The woman who had saved so many lives, animals and otherwise, had been taken by the one creature she loved most. Sarah Middleton, a co-worker from the Wildlife Center, spoke through tears. She was kind, stubborn too. She believed love could fix anything, even instincts. Inside the wildlife community, the response was quieter, but no less heavy. Kenneth Lyles, the officer who had inspected Reef's enclosure just months earlier, said only this: "I wish she'd listened. God, I wish she'd listened." 2 days later, following state protocol for any captive exotic animal involved in a fatality, Reef was euthanized at a state wildlife facility. There were no protests, no appeals, just paperwork and quiet. The backyard was sealed off, the pool drained. What had once been Julia's sanctuary, her safe place, was now a sealed-off scene. Yellow caution tape hung limp in the Florida heat. The gate she once walked through barefoot now stood shut, padlocked. And somewhere in the silence of Clearwater Springs, the air still carried the echo of her final scream. In the days that followed Julia Banks's death, her backyard transformed from a place of connection to a place of mourning. Dozens gathered for a candlelight vigil. They brought flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. Someone taped one of her Instagram prints to the gate, a photo of Julia smiling beside Reef when he was still small enough to fit in her lap. It fluttered in the breeze, barely clinging to the metal as though trying to hold on to what had been lost. But the grief didn't stay local. Across the country, Julia's story reignited a fierce national debate. Should wild animals ever be kept as pets? News anchors and experts debated the ethics. Wildlife organizations posted statements. And quietly, behind the headlines, people began revisiting every moment of her tragic bond with Reef, trying to understand how it could have gone so wrong. Dr. Leah Torres, a reptile behaviorist who had followed Julia's online presence, gave a somber interview that went viral. "People think love overrides instinct," she said. "But instinct doesn't care about love." She explained how alligators are territorial by nature, especially after feeding. Reef had been fed that morning. His body was full, but his survival drive was still active. "That's the most dangerous moment," she said. "They're not hunting because they're hungry. They're asserting control over space, territory, movement, and any intrusion, even from a familiar person, can trigger a fatal reaction." She paused, then added what no one wanted to hear. "This wasn't a fluke. It was always going to happen." Julia's friends bristled at the comment. They wanted her remembered for her heart, not her mistake. But deep down, even they had seen the signs. Reef's growing aggression. Julia's insistence that nothing had changed, that he was different. He wasn't, because Reef, like every alligator, carried millions of years of survival instincts in his blood. He was built for one thing: domination in the water. Julia had tried to rewrite that design with affection, with routine, with hope. And for 5 years it worked. Until it didn't. Animal control officers began reviewing other exotic pet permits in the area. Florida lawmakers mentioned possible legislation reform. But in many ways, the conversation was bigger than permits. It was about belief. The belief that animals can be softened by love. The belief that we're the exception, that we alone are different enough to tame the wild. Julia's story became a symbol of that dangerous optimism. At her memorial, Sarah Middleton spoke again, this time with more reflection than grief. She saved so many animals. But with Reef, she loved him too much to let him go. And he couldn't understand what she was giving him. He only understood what he was. Her voice cracked. "Wild means wild. It's not personal. It just is." Reef's death was quiet. There were no press cameras, no final photos. He was euthanized according to protocol, his body examined for evidence, then cremated. Julia's family declined interviews. Her home was placed up for sale within weeks. But online, her videos remained, still shared, still debated. One clip in particular stood out. In it, Julia is sitting on the pool's edge, her feet just grazing the water. Reef floats beside her, his snout just inches away. She turns to the camera, smiling. "People say it's dangerous," she says. "But I trust him. I really do." Then the video ends. That sentence has been replayed thousands of times, on news panels, Reddit threads, wildlife forums. Some call it haunting. Others call it foolish. But most agree it was sincere. Julia Banks didn't die because she hated nature. She died because she loved it too much to keep her distance. And in doing so, she crossed a line she couldn't come back from. Her story remains not just a tragedy, but a warning. A reminder that the line between affection and assumption is razor thin. That no matter how close you feel to the wild never forgets what it is. Julia Banks believed that love could tame the wild, but in the end, the wild reminded her, and all of us, who it really is. If the story moved you, take a moment to reflect and share it. Help us spread awareness about the risks of keeping wild animals as pets. Hit the subscribe button for more powerful true stories that don't just entertain, they teach. And remember, wild animals aren't toys. They're not pets. And sometimes the price of forgetting that is everything.